She drops the feather duster, and it skitters across the marble like a small confession. Dust motes hang in the suite's light, the way silence hangs in the doorway. Maya's breath comes out short. There is always the possibility of getting caught. Early mornings are safer. Guests asleep, the corridors emptied, the city outside still in that damp, leftover dark. But safe is a thin word when someone with a ledger knows how thin your life is. Edward Ashford is in the doorway. He stands inside the presidential suite like he owns the light. Not because he does, although he does, but because the way he moves through his hotel is a kind of ownership made quiet, exact. His suit is unremarkable in the way the very rich make clothing unremarkable. His face, measured, almost unreadable, holds a small, practiced surprise. It's the expression people make when they've been interrupted from a thought they keep to themselves. "You're in the penthouse," he says. The voice is controlled, steady as a metronome. He doesn't ask her name. He doesn't need to. The hotel knows the names of the people who run its rooms. His staff could have told him. He doesn't look accusing. He looks like someone who has read the last line of a book and wants the rest of the chapter explained. Maya wipes her hands on the thin coat she keeps folded in the cart, the one that never quite warms. She's 32 and moves like she has had to learn not to take up space. Her collar is damp with sweat. There's a bruise, half-healed, down the inside of her thumb from a broken vacuum latch. Behind her, in the travel bag under the sofa, a little green dinosaur book squats like a secret, Micah's favorite. He sleeps on the couch in their tiny apartment when his cough is bad, and Maya keeps the book ready, because sometimes the word dinosaur is enough to make him hold sleep for another hour. "What are you doing up here?" Edward asks. Not why, what. He says it like an observation. Maya could say the obvious, cleaning, work, the overtime. But answers get stuck. The one she needs to say sits at the back of her mouth like a coin she can't swallow. Leonard Voss. The man who has called, who knows her bus schedule, who used to smile in the supermarket and ask how her sick kid is. He has a way of making men in suits remember he exists. Maya has tried keeping Leonard small in her mind, just a number she owed that ballooned with interest, then late fees, then a message that made her stomach drop until it landed somewhere cold. Pay or lose everything. Edward moves past her, across the room, as if reading the arrangement, and stops at the wall. A single hand guide, and he keys the door to the security room. Maya flinches because it is protocol. Housekeepers don't get tours. There is something odd in the insistence. He waits for her to follow. The security room smells of warm plastic and coffee that has gone soft. Monitors stare at him, a constellation of quiet accusations. Parking lot, loading dock, back alley, service elevator, street-level cameras looking out over the snow-slick curb. They are a grid of small truths. On one screen, the plaza outside his hotel is like a chessboard. On another, the angle of his kitchen shows the luminous spill of late-night plating. On the center monitor, the footage sits like a frozen rodent. It's not frozen, it is playing at 3 in the morning. Edward gestures to the monitors without taking his eyes off them, an index finger that asks, "Watch." The footage is crisp, clinical. There is Leonard Voss on the sidewalk 2 days earlier, his shoulders braced against the wind, his breath curling like question marks in the camera's night vision. He crosses the frame, stops, reads a folded piece of paper, drops it into the hands of a man with a black watch and a talker in his ear, Marcus Delgado's build without the open uniform. They speak for a moment. The camera doesn't know what they say. Leonard walks off toward the alley with a pack in his hand. The alley camera captures them in a sliver of grey. Leonard reaches out. He grabs. The recording is a compressed thing. Hand to coat, the shove, Maya's cart tipping, a bright little green dinosaur book tumbling free and landing askew on the pavement like an accusation. No screams, no cinematic saber rattling. A human hand clamped on an arm, a man making a transaction with fear. Edward pauses the footage and the room becomes a room again, the hum of the monitors, the faint staff of the building settling into the morning. "You were followed," he says. Maya's protest is a whispered, necessary thing. I know him. He gave me a loan." "How much?" he asks, not judgmental, practical. 5,000, at first. Her voice is brittle. The arithmetic is a kind of betrayal. The loan turned into 12 because she missed work to take him to the hospital when Micah's cough turned into a fever. She couldn't do both the double shifts and the meds. Leonard's numbers moved like winter water down an old gutter, slow and relentless, until they overflowed. Edward doesn't look at her when she says it. He watches the monitors as if tallying pieces on a board. He asks about threats. She says yes, the messages, the calls that begin with a friendly voice and end with a ledger. He asks about Micah. She says he's 9. He sleeps with 2 stuffed animals. He reads dinosaur facts until his eyes go heavy. He's allergic to penicillin. She does not want to say what happens if she loses Micah's bed or the rent. The weight of possibility is a tangible, dragging thing. He hears her in the way the room pays attention. There is a pause that tightens like a cord. Edward closes one fist and opens it again. "I know his face," he says finally. It's a simple admission. He is not boasting the way a man might boast of having power. He is noticing the way someone notices an old scar and remembers the name of the person who caused it. When he was a child, his mother cleaned rooms in a hotel that smelled like lemon oil and bleach. Someone once called her a nuisance. Someone once threatened her. Edward remembers that ache as a ledger entry in his chest, something small and unpaid that became a way to live. He does not say this as grace. He speaks it as a fact that informs decisions. It explains why the monitors matter to him, why a cleaning cart is not just a cart. It is not pity he offers. It is method. "You're going to tell me everything," he says. His tone advises her that secrecy cannot coexist with safety in the architecture he's built. "Start at the beginning." Maya tells him in pieces, the way you give inventory. The loan came from Leonard through a woman at a street corner who promised cash for signatures. The first time she couldn't pay, he took her name and number like a contract. He talked to her like a friend, then like a creditor. Interest ate into wages. The messages started polite, then worsened into questions: where she went, who she slept near. He was thorough in a way that made the city feel small. On screen, the monitors rotate through a day in which Leonard is not just a man with a predatory line in the bookstore, but someone who shows up at the perimeters where people like Maya exist. He sits in a parked car across from the community clinic. He watches a daycare's sidewalk. He lingers near a grocer where Maya buys chicken on sale. Edward clicks a clip where Leonard leans into the ear of a city councilman, exchanging a cuffed envelope. It's a fraction. No faces are named on the record. But the exchange is motion, and motion implies intent. Councilman Hale's people move differently, Edward says. The name lands cold. Councilman Richard Hale is the kind of face that shows up on television with ribbons and speeches and the sort of smile that wipes off responsibility. Edward does not make accusations. He shows patterns. A business registration filed under a shell company, a donation laced through a third party, a brief handshake captured through the glass of a winter fundraiser where Leonard stands at the edge of the frame like a shadow cast. They are connected. You think he's... Maya starts, and then stops because what does she think? That a man who takes her money is in bed with a man who makes laws. The thought should have felt absurd, but the city is the kind where crooked lines meet and blur. Edward leans back from the monitors. He has people. Everyone knows that about him, but the way he says it is careful. I have security, I have records. I can look where others throw up their hands. But this isn't about me saving you because I can buy what you need. It's about collecting what you need so it can be used as evidence. This is the moment the word hits like a small sun. Evidence. Edward's secret is not just that he watches, it is that his watching is connected to a net that moves, not to muddle in a private vendetta, but to gather and log and hand over. The cameras are not curiosities, they are a chain. Maya looks at him as if he's pointed out a punctuation mark. You're not going to make me pay? I'm not your lender, he says. I'm the man who owns the hotel. I'm also a man who watches people like Leonard when he walks through spaces he shouldn't be in. I can keep you visible. Keep you visible. There is a dissonance in that phrase. Surveillance as refuge. The hotel has always been a place where the private and public exchange notes. Edward's proposal is strange because it turns the instruments of invasion into shields. Maya thinks of privacy as something she has already lost. She thinks of what it means to be visible, safe in the wrong hands, risky in others. But the alternative is a ledger with no future. Before she answers, Edward calls Rowan. He has a lieutenant on the other end who sounds like a man who keeps his hands steady in bad weather. Rowan arrives with practical things. A pamphlet that looks like a visitor pass, a watchful expression, a name badge, clipped like a promise. He is the kind of operator who translates a plan into an itinerary. We'll start by shadowing, Rowan says. There is no theatrical flourish, only the economy of someone who buys insurance with people. We'll keep you where cameras are strong. We'll log every interaction. You don't have to speak to any of his people. If he contacts you, tell us. If you hear from him, record it. We'll take it. Record it, Maya echoes. The word feels invasive. Recording is the same cold instrument that caught Leonard's hand on the alley footage. But the law hears the recorded voice. It can be a ledger. It can shift outrage into enforceable things. We'll do what we can, Rowan says, and his eyes flick to Edward as if to ask how far. Edward answers with the quiet of a man who has seen enough to know the right scale of intervention. No illegal steps. Private security only where we have a right. We won't hide evidence. We'll pass it on. Maya nods because she can't see the roads from here. She nods because this is the first time anyone bigger than her has suggested a system rather than a lecture. It is also the first time someone in power has said, without dramatic flourish, that they will bear witness in a way that can be recorded. Edward does not promise to fix everything. He doesn't make the kind of grand declarations the city sometimes expects from its rich people. He says, practically, we cannot afford to give him an opening. He believes in leverage. He believes in fear. If he thinks... He pauses, chooses his metaphor. If he thinks you can be moved quietly, he will keep moving you. We need him to make a mistake. A bait. The word is not said aloud. It is implied in the arrangement of cameras and assignments, in the guttering pattern of lights in the hotel's alley. It is suggested by the way he positions Maya's shifts so she will be seen. It is implied in the choice to leave the penthouse door a hair less than closed, in the way the cleaning cart is left, where an angle picks up the corridor. It reminds Maya of the time she has left ingredients on the table so Micah would come back to the light. This is the dangerous part. Edward explains the strategy like a surgeon mapping an incision. Maintain presence, collect an escalation, document it, then move. We will not build a trap to lure him to break the law he has not yet intended. We will only provide circumstances where his intentions reveal themselves, he says. The phrase places a legal hinge on the morality of the tactic. Edward is not an avenger. He is an interviewer of patterns. Maya wants to protest that she will not be a rat in someone's game. She wants to say she can handle her own business. But she knows the ledger in her pocket, knows the way the city has trapped her with numbers. Vulnerability is not something one chooses when one is at the bottom of a scale. Do you accept? Edward asks finally, and his voice is not impatient. It is decisive in the way a hinge closes. She takes a breath and says yes. If this story grabbed you, hit like to support Maya. The plan rolls out like a slow machinery. Rowan is meticulous. He changes the assignment roster so that Maya's shifts coincide with the busiest camera angles. He places a security escort at a distance, close enough to intervene if necessary, far enough to be invisible. He arranges for Marcus Delgado to be observed. Marcus is a name Edward knows only by association, a private contractor whose presence in certain neighborhoods is a fact the hotel has catalogued. Marcus belongs to Leonard's outer ring, muscle with a military shape and the kind of network that sells loyalty for money and takes the rest with force. Edward's team does not act with bravado. They start small, inserting visibility like a pacemaker. They bring Maya a badge that declares she is on an official maintenance call. They make sure the guest list at the front desk shows a maintenance request for the presidential suite at dawn, an ironclad paper trail of presents. Cameras are angled to record the corridor and the service elevator. Microphones are set to capture raised voices as policy allows. Every recorded moment becomes a way to turn intimidation into paper and audio. For Maya, the first days are a strange, amplified version of the life she already knows. The same bus breaks in the same place, the same co-worker stoops to speak in the laundry room, but the hotel's attention is now a grid that includes care. Rowan watches her with the clinical neutrality of someone keeping a patient from injury. He suggests routes for her to take home that avoid the bus stops Leonard frequents. He pins a number to her blouse so she can text if she feels watched. He stays several paces behind when she leaves the building, a shadow the shape of a promise. There is a small private joy in observing the difference. On the second night after a 12-hour shift, Maya rides the elevator up to her tiny apartment and finds Mrs. Okafor waiting in the stairwell. Mrs. Okafor is an older neighbor from the 4th floor who bakes and brings tinfoil pies and knows every child's name in the building. She looks at Maya with a softness that means she has noticed the substitution of Rowan's shadow for the absence of any father figure. "You look less scared," Mrs. Okafor says, and it's something like relief. Maya allows herself to smile. It is small. She thinks of Micah on the couch with his dinosaur book. She thinks of how normal houses can feel when a bigger house chooses to keep watch. She does not yet know what it will cost. The bait works in the coarse way of all things designed to coax people into being themselves. Leonard notices Maya more as she leaves the hotel in the daytime, carrying the scent of the lobby and the badge. He starts by asking small, cheap questions to friends of friends. Did she move? Where does her brother go to school? He arranges a casual run-in in the grocery aisle with someone he knows who knows someone who can mention a child's school. Each thread is a way to measure the cloth of the woman who is trying to live small. One evening, the monitors catch Leonard at the entrance to the building. He stands with his back to the glass, hands in his coat. His movement is minimal. He knows how to be a man who does not call attention to himself. He walks in with a mannered confidence, like a guest who believes all doors owe him welcome. Rowan sees him on the feed and reroutes a maintenance request to intersect with him, leaving the corridor in a pattern that draws Leonard into a chosen frame. Leonard's approach is not cinematic. He does not stroll in like a swaggering villain. He's a man practiced in the manners that make the city allow him a space. He says the right things. He asks about hours. When Maya responds, he apologizes for a small mistake. He reaches for an old script of kindness. "I didn't mean to frighten you." He says it with a smoothness designed to repair. "You should have left us alone," Maya says. Her voice has learned to be efficient. Leonard's face, in the way the cameras capture it, has none of the sympathy he attempts to summon. The exchange is brief. Rowan's presence is not seen by Leonard. He keeps his distance, an invisible cord. The camera microphone picks up a small, casual threat. "You know how leverage works," Leonard says. "You don't want trouble for your kid." The words are not violent so much as transactional. They are the kind of thing that carries a shape heavy enough to bend a neck. When the corridor quiets and Leonard walks away, the monitors capture his exit in close detail. Footsteps, the rustle of a coat. The camera in the street shows him disappearing into the snow like a man who carries his own weather. Edward watches as he always does, indexing what has changed. Leonard has a technique. He uses proximity and the city's overlooked seams to put small weights on people's chests. He does not need to break doors to take everything. "He's escalating," Rowan says. He mentioned the kid. The phrase lands like a bell. Recording a man who mentions a child changes the tenor of a case. It makes the threat external instead of something that can be shrugged off. The feed captures Leonard's conversation at the corner with Delgado. Delgado's face is in sharper focus on another screen, an outline of someone who has been paid to stand in for violence. Marcus Delgado is a name with a file on the desk, one that reads like a resume and like a pattern. Ex-military, contractor networks, loyalty that can be traded. Edward's team notes the intersection. The tension increases. For Maya, every step home feels heavier. She knows Leonard's shadow, as you know a storm front on the weather map. She finds herself checking over her shoulder at bus stops. She starts to voice things she had not had the breath to say, small rituals that protective people do in the face of a corporate-sized threat. She tells Micah to sleep with his door closed, to stay with Mrs. Okafor if she ever can't be there. Micah, 9 and brave in the way children must be, makes her a badge out of paper and tape and insists she wears it like armor. One night, Leonard makes a phone call that is recorded. The audio is a low, dangerous thing. "I like things tidy," he says into a phone, "and leverage is the best kind." The voice is a thing you could translate into a tax form. It promises nuisance and consequence without blood. The recording is enough to change the way Rowan breathes. Edward's observers suggest moving Micah temporarily. It is an invasive idea, moving a child into the house of the man who owns the city's skyline. But the thinking is pragmatic. The house is well guarded. It is a place that stabilizes. Edward offers it not as a castle, but as a house with walls armed by presence and legality. "We can provide a watch," he says. "We can rotate staff. We can get him into school through proper channels." Maya balks at first. Pride is an expense she cannot always pay. She refuses the elegantly wrapped refuge because she does not want to owe this man everything. But Leonard's name begins to sound like a clock. The note of him saying leverage in a soft voice on the recording does something to the spaces she lives in. It makes the bed smaller. It makes the city large and indifferent. She remembers the pinch of a single unpaid bill that became the sum of a life, the way doors closed. She goes to Edward's office because she is tired of dreaming the same fear. The house is less a threat than paperwork. There is a sitting room with big windows that look over water and a kind of slatted calm. The house smells of lemon and coffee and old books. It is a room that knows how to instruct you to breathe more completely without asking permission. Micah is small on the couch, a dinosaur book open on his knees, and Edward watches him like something dear and fragile. He does not intrude on the moment. He is a man who knows the gravity of someone else's child. "You can come for a week," he says, and the offer is practical and finite. "We'll make arrangements with school. We'll rotate staff. It's temporary." Maya looks at Micah and recognizes the fragility of the choice. She thinks of the bills and the ways a city's systems can close. She thinks of the sound of Leonard's voice in that recording. She thinks of what it would be to keep her child safe for more than a blink. She accepts. They move quickly. There are forms and logistic things, implied permissions, declarations of guardianship for a short term, statements that will be kept in files. There is a sense of seeing the engine behind a man whose life has always been organized around giving and taking. Edward makes calls that are not theatrical, to a school administrator who accepts a temporary transfer of attendance, to a pediatrician who confirms medication. The house is practical in its protection. Cameras placed to watch the approach to the property, staff who will log visitors, a sequence of keys that will move like a lockstep. Nothing illegal, only the use of resources that the law permits. Micah settles into a couch like a boy who has been given a temporary island. He opens the dinosaur book and reads the words aloud with the sort of trust children have in small facts. He tells Edward which dinosaur is his favorite, Stegosaurus, and Edward listens. He is patient. He is quiet. He does not ask too many questions. Maya leaves him in Edward's care, like sliding a small coin into a slot that makes the machine hum. She feels the whir of mechanism and the vulnerability of exchange. But the city does not accept reprieves easily. The pattern Leonard has built is not a single line. It has tendrils. He notices a change in the way Maya carries herself. He notes that she is less available. He hears rumor on a street corner that she is being watched. He does what predators do when their prey becomes inconvenient. He increases pressure. He starts showing up in places he once avoided. He calls in favors. He moves with a deliberate thumb over a map. One morning, the monitors show him at the hotel again, but this time he is not alone. Marcus Delgado is with him, and together they move toward the service elevator. The heat in the security room grows like an animal. Edward watches them like someone waiting for a hand to fall and make a sound. He does not move to intercept. He does not want to risk evidence being adulterated. The plan requires documentation of intent and action. Maya climbs the service stair with a cleaning cart and a layer of winter between her coat and the day's calorie. She passes the service elevator, opens the door, and Leonard steps into the corridor like a man who expects to find no resistance. He speaks with a friendly tone that is the opposite of polite. "You never called me back," he says. Maya straightens as if receiving a formal reprimand. She says, "I told you to leave me alone." The words are small but precise. Leonard's smile takes on the soft quality of someone comfortable with a small cruelty. He leans in close, and the corridor's cameras frame them like a photograph waiting to be developed. The microphone picks up the edge of his next sentence before it slides into a place that even the cameras cannot explain out loud. You know what happens when leverage goes uncollected. Rowan's hand is a pressure on the radio at the edge of what the security team can do. Edward watches. He watches the arc of Leonard's mouth, the way a man believes in what he owns. Leonard does not make a threat in a theatrical voice. He makes it in the language of harvest, quiet, inevitable, the tone of a man convinced of permissions. There is a moment in which the corridor becomes too small for what it contains. Maya feels the air densify like weather. Her cart brushes a grain of the floor, and the dinosaur book packed away imagines a child's fingers turning a page. Someone in the lobby, on a street corner, a neighbor in bed, any observer, could look up and see nothing more than a conversation. But the microphones absorb everything, and cameras keep their impartial frame. Leonard's voice is caught on the feed as he says casually, "Tell the boy to watch his back." There is no sound of a blow. There is the economy of menace. He leaves smiling, an ordinary man who feeds a ledger. Maya, finishing her shift that night, walks home with the taste of the world in her mouth, metallic and small. Edward is waiting at the hotel's entrance because he wants to move fast. He says, "We have to get Micah out tonight." The decision uncoils like a spring. It is one of those times Edward does not discuss the moral calculus. He acts. Rowan calls a car, not an army. A quiet van pulls up at the curb, and Marcus Delgado, if he is in the game, does not appear here. This maneuver is a matter of logistics and legal permission. Papers are signed with an efficiency that feels like competence rather than pity. Micah climbs into a warm back seat with his dinosaur book and looks back at his sister with an unfailing small faith that everything is doable. Maya rides with them for the first stretch because she needs to make sure he is tucked in. Edward is in the driver's voice on the phone with the pediatrician. who confirms records and medication. It is a blur of headquarters and routing and assurance. There is no spectacle to it. There is only a chosen choreography. Move the vulnerable into a protected coordinate and let the evidence gather. At the estate, the world seems too quiet. The house sits back from the road the way a watchman sits back from the fire. Cameras angle out to the gate. A handful of staff are stationed like human routers. Micah is led into a living room that is generous with blankets and light. He sets his dinosaur book down and runs a thumb between the pages like a child testing the seam of continuity. Edward watches him with something like a guardian's concentration, but less theatrical and more habitual. Someone who has made watching into a practice. He does not make promises he cannot keep. He says simply, "We'll keep him safe while this moves forward." And then Leonard does something that stretches the plan and makes the air worth watching. Leonard shows up where he has no business. The gate is the first boundary of the house, and cameras across the road pain their lenses on him like eyes in glass. He stands in a line of snow with shoulders squared. Delgado is with him, a shape that suggests he has been compensated for the escalation. Leonard walks up to the intercom and presses the button. He speaks for all the sound of the city to hear, but most importantly, he speaks into a device that is recorded. His voice is composed, ordinary like a man who orders coffee. "I need to speak to Edward Ashford." The intercom captures his breath and his name. It is a registered contact. On other screens, Rowan's hand moves, precise and practiced, as a chain of secure communications unspools. There is no immediate run to arms. Edward chooses to answer because he does not want to let the unknown define the day. He answers through a speaker with the composure of a man who reads danger as currency. "You're on private property," Edward says. "Tell me what you want." Leonard's reply is thin as printed paper. "I want the debt taken care of." Edward hears the phrase the way you hear a simple reminder. He says, "Colder now. We have records of your activities. We have recorded comments about a child being used as leverage. You should leave." There is a moment, one of those mental slivers in which consequences become visible on faces. Leonard's smile thins. The camera on the gate sits like an eyewitness. Leonard's shoulders move in a small, human gesture of recalculation. The shift is subtle but meaningful. The man who has made a living extracting a pound of fear from people's evenings is now being seen on a legal map. The existence of a recording is a hinge. Edward does not celebrate. He moves his team toward harder work, verifying the statements, ensuring the audio is catalogued, watching for the change in Leonard's pattern. He makes a call he has not made yet, to a federal prosecutor, tentative and non-committal, to lay out facts rather than ask for miracles. He does not expect instant arrests. The law is a long-haul machine. Edward knows that. What he can offer is documentation, a chain of custody of shame, and a public record that is harder to erase than rumor. But Leonard's presence at the gate is enough to pull the room tight. Someone has stepped into daylight. The monitors show a man who thought he could be invisible and is instead registering as a subject. Maya watches a live feed in the study and feels a kind of small, fragile hope. It flickers like a match. In the hallway outside the estate, a snowflake lands on an iron spoke and melts. The city keeps watching itself. The cameras keep rolling. The monitors keep their cold attention on things people think they can hide. The shocking secret Edward revealed to Maya, the fact that he had been watching, that he had the means and the will to gather what the law might use, has changed the calculus. It has not solved everything. It has only made certain that the next move will be seen, recorded, and counted. Maya folds her hands and considers the weight of a man who keeps files like prayers. She thinks of her mother, who used to wipe tables until her hands smelled faintly of lemon and tears. She thinks of Micah's small, steady breathing echoing through the house and of the dinosaur's green spine, of the way a child presses his palm to the page and believes the words will protect him. Outside, the snow presses a hush over the city. On the monitor, Leonard's car pulls away slowly, an ordinary engine working its way through streets lined with indifferent lights. For a moment, the danger is like a knot. It is still there, tight and true, but its shape is known. Edward has placed the knot under the microscope, and now he will wait for the man who tied it to make a mistake. The morning tilts toward something else, rows of evidence becoming a trail, and the knowledge that seeing is only the first step. Maya sits in the estate's kitchen with a cup of coffee that tastes foreign in her mouth. She watches a framed photograph on the mantel, Edward's mother, small and proud, holding a dust rag like a flag. There is a sadness in his smile when he looks at that photograph. The sight of him looking at it, and then at her, makes the world feel simultaneously safer and more complicated. The cameras keep their patient watch. The city extends its arms, cold, indifferent, necessary. Outside, Councilman Hale's name will appear on a ledger of donations. Marcus Delgado's presence will be logged. The trail is not a single bright highway. It is a tangle of alleys and receipts and voices, and Edward's secret is that he possesses the will and infrastructure to turn those fragments into a whole. He will not step into the law's place, but he will pass the pieces to it. For now, they wait and collect. For now, a child sleeps under a different roof. For now, Leonard knows his face is known. And in the small room where monitors pulse like low heartbeats, Edward leans in and watches his screens the way a man watches for a storm. He does not smile. He does not make promises. He catalogues. He plans. He remembers the woman who once held a rag in her hand and the man who once told her she must be careful. There is a long list of things yet to happen. There will be a confrontation at the gate that will expose more than threats. There will be ledgers pulled apart and handed to a prosecutor who will then decide whether to move. There will be Mr. Delgado and the councilman's clipped name, and a city that will slowly, reluctantly look at where power enables predation. But in this moment, as the dawn stretches out thin fingers across the estate's lawn, the most startling secret remains simple. The billionaire knew. He watched. He had built a lattice of sight and was willing to use it in service of the woman with the thin coat and the boy with the dinosaur book. The truth of that, less thrilling than a heroic rescue, less flashy than a front-page scandal, has the power. The morning after Leonard stood at the gate, the estate felt smaller in the best way, not diminished but concentrated. The cameras had recorded everything, his breath on the intercom, the cadence of demand. But what mattered now was how a man rearranged his life when someone else could show what he had done. Edward did not sleep much. He moved through the house with the same careful economy he used in the hotel. No dramatics, only action. He and Rowan reviewed the feeds again and again until raw footage became a timeline. Leonard's approach to Maya, the alley grab, the grocery corner where he had lingered. They matched faces to payments with the help of a quiet woman in an office at the hotel who read corporate filings like scripture and shaded them until shell companies showed their seams. Marcus Delgado's name appeared in purchase records, contract logs, even in the back pages of a contractor roster filed under a different corporate shell. Councilman Richard Hale's name showed up not as a single deed, but as a pattern of contributions, host appearances, fundraisers, where the exchanges were almost ceremonial. They made packets, paperwork that turned accusation into something prosecutable. Every stamped clip, every email exchange, every donation matched a time and place. Edward had his people label each piece, origin, custody, who touched it when. It was bureaucracy as armor. It was not glamorous. It was necessary. Maya sat with him once, watching as the stack grew. She had thought evidence would look different, louder perhaps, like a shout that would topple a man. Instead, it was tedious and patient. Invoices, timestamps, tax returns that only a person with time to stare could read. She felt more exposed than protected in the beginning. The act of letting someone else catalogue her fear was another kind of intimacy. "We're not doing anything without a chain," Edward said softly when she asked what would happen next. "I can't bring you justice with anger. I can bring it with records." She wanted to ask how long it would take, but the phrase lodged in her. The law was a long-haul machine. Instead, she asked the only immediate question that mattered. "Will he come for him?" "He might," Edward admitted. "He might take a run at silence because that's how his business survives. That's why we prepare for the days he chooses to make himself obvious." Rowan increased perimeter checks at the school bus stop. 2 women from a local community service group were engaged to pick Micah up when a staff rotation left gaps. Mrs. Okafor offered to double her visits. Even neighbours they had barely met left casseroles and eyes that said more than casseroles ever could. "We saw, we care." The city does not always save people, but people sometimes do. Leonard did not wait. He made a choice typical of those who believe they are owed. Panic and a blunt approach came when a sideways exit was no longer guaranteed. He started to call favors. He pushed men who could intimidate into motion. He began to move money in places he thought would not be noticed. He also made mistakes, panicked passes, uncharacteristically sharp phone calls that were undecorated by caution. The recordings caught them. A voice recorded with a static edge. "Find me what I need. Make it disappear." It was not a threat with violence painted on it like a promise. It was the crude arithmetic of someone facing a ledger that would not balance. On a grey day, Delgado's truck was recorded idling on a side street near one of Leonard's shell companies. A courier left, later returning with sealed envelopes. Edward watched the feed and felt the old ache. His mother's back bent over a cart, refold into something like resolve. He called a single number, a federal prosecutor who had been on the receiving end of tips in the past, a professional who listened to facts without being moved by spectacle. Their meeting was short. Edward presented the stack, camera timestamps, neighborhood witness statements, a trail of transfers that led through corporate smoke to a small set of names. He did not ask for a snap decision. He asked only that someone look and note the shape of it. "We'll open a preliminary investigation," the prosecutor said, measured but not unkind. "We'll want originals, chain of custody, sworn statements." "It will be there," Edward promised. "Everything." He did not promise arrest or the end of fear. He promised documentation. It was the closest thing to a weapon the law allowed him to wield, not muscle, but evidence. Leonard realized momentum had shifted when men in suits he knew as friends began to avoid his calls. One late afternoon, he drove to a diner where he used to sit and found a place empty. He stood by the counter, proto-angry and bewildered, replaced invisibly by a new pattern. The city's networks had started to shiver. Men who once looked the other way had begun to look at each other instead. Rumor is a fragile thing. When the right people start to look, it becomes heavy and hard to carry. That same week, the hotel's security intercept logged a new contact. A call Leonard made to a known associate, a man with ties to a city contractor who had worked for Hale's campaigns. The call was terse, impatient. Leonard used words like move and make it quiet and no exposure. He also used the name of a campaign event where a donation had been made months before. The prosecutor listened to the clip and took notes. Hale's office, a city hall of press-ready smiles, said nothing publicly, but in private, a flurry of aides whispered about donors and whether anyone could be tied publicly to someone with Delgado's profile. Edward did not relish the unraveling. He felt the moral weight of making private power visible. He had years of watching men take and nothing to show for it. The collection of paperwork did not repair the small things Leonard had already taken. The time, the sleep, the innocence in a child who still believed dinosaurs were magic. but it ensured that the next time someone tried to make a ledger of fear, it would stand on paper, in a way that was hard to deny. Maya sat in on one of the recorded sessions where prosecutors listened to clips. She was allowed to watch from an observation room. She felt nervous, as if she were a defendant in some hidden way. Had her honesty been a mistake? But the prosecutor asked straightforward questions and took notes. Her statements were filed. Her voice, once brittle, tightened into something like clarity as she described what had happened and what it had cost. These acts, making notes, signing affidavits, placing copies in envelopes stamped with dates, felt like slow stitches in a torn shirt. Every signature was another way to frame a story so that it could be understood in court if it came to that. It was tedious. It was progress. Leonard's panic became visible in the ways criminals panic. They lash at the edges. He tried to contact people who might muddy the waters, but men he counted on were suddenly pragmatic. Delgado, sensing the grid closing, made a mistake that would be the kind of error statistics favor. He contacted a man he had not used in years and used his real name. The broker, a jittery contractor with tattoos at the collar, panicked and took the quickest route out of town. He left a trail of texts and a forgotten receipt, tiny things that became links. The more Leonard moved, the more residue he left. He sent a man to meet with a mid-level official who had been on the edge of loyalty. The official, afraid of his own career, took the meeting in a public coffee shop, and then, in an act of personal interest, texted one of his daughters about the oddness of the call. The daughter, who worked in local news, mentioned it at a reporter's table. Threads crossed. The city is compact like that. Rumors become reports, which become public anxiety. When local reporters started to ask questions, Hale's press secretary prepared the usual denials. But the network was contaminated. Contributions linked to shell companies were traced. Campaign schedules matched odd venue rentals where the same men appeared. Hale's calendars were cleaned up, statements offered. A spokesperson said the councilman's office would cooperate if anyone brought proof. The proof was becoming thick. Leonard felt time contract into a sequence of panic-driven choices. He tried to sell a property overseas and found banks slow and cautious. He threatened people softer than he had ever threatened before because everything brash now had the potential to be recorded and used as evidence. He started to look tired and small in the city's winter light. The day the prosecutor issued subpoenas, small, sharp court documents that asked for records, Leonard realized the game he had run for years was unraveling. He did not go to the courthouse. He did not stand on the steps and declare innocence. He ducked into back rooms, muttered into phones, and tried to make deals that required other men to take a risk on his behalf. Men who took risks for him in the past were not as quick to respond. At the hotel, Edward finally allowed himself a breath long enough to feel vertigo. He did not gloat. The work was far from done. Prosecutors could file a case and lose it. Witnesses could change stories. Evidence could be challenged. The law was patient and jealous. It needed time to gather proof in a way that could withstand defense strategies. That is why Edward had done the mechanical work. He had provided a steady sequence, a paper and video pedigree. He also kept watching. He watched Leonard shrink in public life and become frantic in private. He watched Delgado leave town to a destination with too many airports and too few ties. The phones that used to ring for Leonard did not ring as often. Men who had smiled in his company now looked like people who had dodged a puddle. In the small hours of a March morning, Maya sat with Micah at her side and let him do what he did best: draw dinosaurs. He drew stegosaurs with exaggerated plates and labeled them with names he had invented, monsters that ate fear for breakfast. Maya let herself smile because it felt like an allowed luxury. The house felt less threatened. She still flinched when her phone buzzed, but the muscle had lost some of its twitch. She started to speak differently about her life. where before she had muttered the arithmetic of what she owed and what she could not pay, she now catalogued the ways she could build again. A legal aid clinic called. Someone in Edward's team had pushed their number along with the prosecutor's packet, and an intake appointment was scheduled. It was small but vital. Someone would help her straighten out consumer records, advise on tenants' rights, and talk through bankruptcy options with respect rather than judgment. These were banal, bureaucratic things that had been blocked by fear. Now they were moving. Her agency returned in pieces. She agreed to give a sworn statement, not because someone told her to, but because she wanted to turn the ledger into something that might help others. She spoke at a community meeting about predatory lenders, her voice raw but not brittle. Other faces in the room were nodding, some familiar, neighbors, the woman from the grocery, a single mother who had taken the same route and kept her secrets. They talked about how small debts could become huge traps, how the city's systems could be weaponized against the poor. It was an ugly subject dressed in facts, but it made people look at their own ledgers. There was a cost. The public work made Maya's life less invisible. She had to manage a new kind of exposure. People who had once been kind now regarded her with pity or curiosity. But she also found a new thing. Names. People who had been victimized began to collect, and the prosecutor's office took notice of a pattern. Victims provide context, and context builds cases. Leonard's private life began to collapse in late spring. Men who had been useful to him came to make deals with prosecutors rather than him. Delgado, whose loyalty had been transactional, found his contracts drying up. He did not return to town. The men who once offered imprecise protection started working for hotels in other cities where connections were cleaner. Hale's office shrugged publicly and denounced rumor, but internally staff prepared reports and called in legal counsel. One afternoon, Leonard came to the hotel lobby under the pretense of meeting a local vendor. He moved through the space like a man trying to be ordinary and failed. The cameras recorded his approach and flagged his face as a subject of interest. Rowan, on the floor, watched quietly and made a decision that honored the law rather than him. He asked a uniformed officer at the desk to check on a guest interaction. The officer did what officers often do, took a statement, filed a report. It was a small act. It was also the sort of bureaucratic turn that eats time and comfort for men like Leonard. The prosecutors filed for indictments in stages, secured by affidavits, financial records, and recorded threats. The news cycle caught wind, and stories appeared that used words like predatory lending ring, campaign donations under scrutiny, and private contractor ties to intimidation. Hale went before a council committee, answered questions in a way that suggested embarrassment rather than guilt. He stopped appearing at ribbon cuttings for a while. The story was not over. It was, however, no longer invisible. For Maya, the most immediate milestone was quiet. The shots at Micah's file were formalized. The temporary guardianship had been extended through the prosecutor's preliminary inquiry. The school paperwork remained adjusted. The pediatrician's notes were logged and available. A social worker met with Maya to plan a long-term path that did not require hiding in someone else's house. It was not a neat fix. It was a slow transition, filled with small appointments and bureaucratic patience. The thing that made it bearable was that there was a plan and people who would keep it. Maya found she could sleep a little deeper. She took small risks, an extra shift, a new route home that avoided alleys. She practiced saying the phrase, "I deserve better," in the mirror until the edges of it softened into belief. She began to volunteer in modest ways at the community clinic where she had once stood waiting for hours. It became a way to pay forward the kindness that had been given to her. Edward watched the unraveling of Leonard's operation with a cautious satisfaction that never tipped into triumph. He knew the city's machinery could be slow and capricious. He also knew the mechanics of power. He had not shown Maya screens merely to terrify her. He had revealed the secret he kept, the network of cameras, the archival records, the will to gather evidence, because secrecy had been the weapon Leonard used. He had a memory of his mother, small and precise, how she walked through rooms and left corners clean. He had kept that image like a ledger entry. It informed him, but it did not define him. He was not interested in replacing one set of predators with another. He wanted the law to do its work. When the prosecutor called to say a grand jury had returned indictments on several counts connected to Leonard and Delgado, conspiracy, extortion, campaign finance violations tied to shell companies, Edward felt the odd, modest relief that comes when a difficult, necessary thing is finally allowed to be named. It did not end pain, it only made it accountable. Leonard was arrested in a clumsy morning outside a motel in a town 2 states away. He looked tired and small, less a man of menace than a man who had failed to make himself invisible. The arrest was not cinematic. There was no dragged confession. There was paperwork, a set of cuffs, and the quiet of a person being processed. The headlines called it justice. For Maya, justice was less certain, for now it meant the man who had touched her life was caught in a net he had not expected. Delgado's status remained ambiguous for a time. There were indications he had fled, perhaps to a place where contracts could be sustained by cash and distance. The investigation continued. Hale faced inquiries, internal audits, and a bruising period of public scrutiny. His eventual resignation from a committee was reported with tempered headlines. The city churned with the aftershocks of a network collapsing. Public officials called for reforms. Creditors began to be named in public forums in ways that made banks and lenders watch their own processes more carefully. These were small policy shifts compared to the harm already done, but they mattered. The moral complexity lingered. Edward watched it with eyes that had seen more than one solution. He continued to watch the hotel's footage, not in expectation of further mischief, but because vigilance had become his practice. He kept a file labeled Evidence Williams, with thin, neat tabs. He went to visit his mother's grave one afternoon and left a small stone. He did not speak of heroes. He spoke of responsibility and the ways private resources could be applied to public problems without becoming substitutes for institutional justice. Maya returned to her apartment in the late summer. The couch where Micah had once slept was a memory. He had moved back into his bed with a sense of private victory. The dinosaur book had a new crease where he had once fallen asleep reading. Mrs. Okafor brought over a pie and an invitation to a potluck where neighbors would talk about ways to help one another survive the winter. It was small. It was perfect. She had new paperwork to manage. Statements filed with prosecutors, a small winnings from a civil settlement possibility hinted at by legal aid, and the practical instructions for securing her credit. It felt like building a house out of receipts and courageous phone calls. In the evenings, she sometimes thought of Leonard's thin smile and the way he had believed fear could be led like a horse. Now she held in her chest a different feeling, that being seen can sometimes be refuge. Micah resumed his ritual of drawing dinosaurs and insisting on ridiculous bedtime questions. He argued one night about the exact number of plates on a stegosaurus and accused Edward of being wrong. Edward listened and smiled, the kind of small smile that does not ask for gratitude. He had done something that cost him little in litigation, but perhaps much in attention. He did not expect thanks. He had expected and wanted something quieter, a rectification. The city settled into a new normal, where the story of the ring was a cautionary tale and a prompt for slow policy change. The prosecutor filed charges that would take months to sort through in hearings and depositions. Evidence would be challenged. Witnesses would be cross-examined. Victories in court would not be instantaneous. They would be the kind of slow, legalist moves that change systems a degree at a time. For Maya, The relief was not the headline, but the night she could breathe without the weight of someone else's hand on her life. Yet, the story left a residue. Surveillance used for protection is still surveillance, and the ethics of watching remained entangled in the human cost of being observed. Edward himself never stopped acknowledging that his access to sight was a form of power that must be handled with care. He instituted policies in his hotel that limited who could access footage and required legal oversight for any request. He did it because he did not want the instruments he used to protect to be used to punish the vulnerable. Months later, Maya met with a small group at the community center. They were collecting signatures for an ordinance to make predatory lending practices more transparent. She spoke for a few minutes. Quiet, clear, steady. She was not a lawyer. She was a woman who had been leveraged and had survived by being seen. Her testimony mattered in ways the cameras could not catch. It was public and human and messy. She quoted a line she had once heard in the security room when Edward had asked her to tell the whole story, that the law moves only on the things it can measure. She laughed, brittle but true, and the group applauded. Edward stood at the back of the room, not as a benefactor on display, but as an observer who had become part of a story. He listened to Maya with an attention that had once been tactical and had softened into something like respect. He did not seek applause. He had kept a secret and revealed it to change the calculus of a life. The secret had been expensive in ways he could not have anticipated. It had also been necessary. There were still risks. Men like Leonard do not always disappear elegantly. Politics had a way of protecting those it needed to, and secrets sometimes reconstituted themselves in new shapes. But a public record existed now. Documents and footage and sworn statements were assembled in a way that made replication of the same system harder. That was not vindication. That was prevention. Less glorious, perhaps, but vital. On the late afternoon, Maya walked with Micah toward the park. He ran ahead and then turned to wave back at her, dinosaur book clutched to his chest. He did not run like a child who had been shuttered. He ran like a child who had learned his shape again. They stopped by a bench and sat, the two of them shoulder to shoulder. Edward passed across the green at a respectful distance, then turned and kept walking. He had done what he could do. Maya looked at Micah and then up at the skyline where the hotel's top gleamed like a patient watch. She did not feel saved by a billionaire. She felt, instead, that a city had been forced to look. That looking had been the only thing that had ever balanced the ledger Leonard kept. When the first arrests were made public, when the prosecutor made a press statement about accountability and the slow work of justice, Maya read the words in a quiet kitchen and felt a wash of something complex. Vindication, brushed with fatigue. Relief laced with the knowledge that it had not ended for everyone, and a pointed gratitude that did not ask for return. At night, before Micah fell asleep, he put his palm on the dinosaur book and whispered to it like it was talisman. Maya listened and let the world be small and ordinary for a while. She had been seen and helped. She had also learned to stand. The city around her made room for that possibility, imperfectly but with new attention. The shocking secret the billionaire had revealed to the Maid, the admission that his eyes were not only for profit but could be turned toward protection, had shifted a life. It had not been a miracle in the bookseller's sense. It had been a slow, bureaucratic unraveling of power that moved through cameras, ledgers, and a prosecutor's patient work. It had changed the ledger for one woman and her child, and in doing so, opened a path for others to be heard. Months later, Edward sat in his office and looked at a photograph of his mother. He placed it back on the desk gently, like a man who refused heroics but accepted responsibility. He knew the city's systems needed more than private interventions. He had used what he had, sight, money, staff, to tilt the scales for someone who had been preyed upon. He would continue to think about how to make structures more just. he would continue to watch, but with processes that included oversight. Maya, now more resolute than fearful, walked past the hotel one morning and did not cross the street. She lifted her chin and let the building be a backdrop rather than a presence in her life. She carried with her the knowledge that power can be used toward repair. She also understood that vigilance, caution, and community were what kept the ledger from snapping back. The city changed in small ways. The council held hearings, lenders tightened disclosure statements, community groups organized education sessions. Not everyone was saved, not every wound closed. But the net that had protected Maya and Micah was now part of a public story that would be harder to ignore the next time someone tried to turn fear into profit. If this story moved you, subscribe for more dramatic, true-to-life thrillers and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from.